TeraFlex designed the long arm kit to significantly increase ride comfort and vehicle handling while driving a lifted Jeep Wrangler. The purpose of long arms is to correct the changes that occur to the suspension when you lift the vehicle more than 3.5 inches. Adding taller springs, among other changes, alters the suspension geometry, axle caster and pinion angles, and the overall ride comfort. It should be noted that while short arms will also correct these changes, long arms create a flatter arm angle, which creates a more comfortable and predictable ride. Installing the TeraFlex long arm kit involves a significant amount of time. However, no individual task is overly complex. There is simply a lot to do. There are a number of steps where having a second pair of hands is very useful. Before we get into things though, let's look at a few of the more uncommon tools that you may need. A plasma or acetylene torch or a cutoff wheel to cut off the factory brackets. A ball joint press to install the new bushings into the axle. You will need drill bits up to 11/16 inch. For Jeeps with a turbo, you will need a right angle drill, some short drill bits, and a step bit. It is also best to start this installation with an empty or close to empty gas tank. Lift the vehicle off the ground and remove the tires. If you have metal rock sliders, then use the brackets where these mount to the body as lift points. If you mount to the frame, then you will need to adjust the lift points during the install. Remove the front sway bar links. Disconnect the front track bar from the axle end. Disconnect the drag link from the knuckle. Hang the track bar and drag link up out of the way. If you are replacing the track bar, then feel free to completely remove it. Remove the front brake calipers and hang them off to the side. Do not hang them by the brake lines. Remove the rotor. There should be a small Torx head bolt holding it in place. Remove the backing plate. Disconnect the ABS sensor. Remove the bracket connecting the ABS line to the top of the knuckle. Disconnect the axle actuator plug on the right side of the axle. If you have a Rubicon with lockers, then you will need to disconnect the locker actuator plug. Also, detach these wires anywhere that they connect to the axle. Disconnect the vent hose. Support the axle and remove the shocks. Cut the ties holding the ABS line to the spring mount brake line bracket. Remove and discard the brake line brackets from the lower control arms and spring mounts by first prying open the bracket and carefully removing the brake lines. Then detach and discard the bracket. Disconnect the front drive shaft from the axle and hang it up out of the way. In the video, we remove the drive shaft completely so that it would not be in the way of the camera, but this is not necessary if you don't want to do this. Remove the heat shield covering the frame end of the front upper control arm. Loosen the bolts on the control arms. Lower the axle enough to remove the springs. Double check to make sure all the brake lines, ABS lines, sensors, hoses, and plugs are disconnected from the front axle and control arms. To remove the axle, we will lower it down onto a table, which has wheels so that we can move the table around. If you don't have the luxury of having a table like we do, then you can use jack stands. Remove the lower control arms from both the axle and the frame. Disconnect the upper arms from the axle. At this point, the axle should be fully disconnected, so the vehicle can be lifted up or the axle is moved out of the way if you're not using a lift. Remove the upper control arms from the frame end. On the passenger side of Jeeps with a turbo, there is an auxiliary coolant pump, which will need to be moved out of the way to access the bolt. It can be replaced after the bracket is cut off. We do not show this being replaced in the video. Remove the exhaust skid plate. This skid plate won't be reinstalled, but retain the hardware for use later. Move to the rear of the vehicle and remove the sway bar links. Disconnect the brake line bracket from the rear axle by removing the bolt holding it in place. Detach the rear calipers and hang them out of the way. Remove the ABS line. Disconnect the rear drive shaft from the axle and hang it up out of the way. Like in the front, we removed the drive shaft completely so that it was out of the way. Remove the bracket connecting the emergency brake lines to the body. Pull down on the e-brake line and clamp a locking plier onto the eyelet. Disconnect the emergency brake line. Using pliers, detach the e-brake line from the axle. Feed the emergency brake lines up over the cross member so that the lines will travel under the cross member once they are reattached to the axle. Disconnect the rear track bar from the axle. Remove the breather hose, and if you have it, the locker actuator plug. Support the axle and remove the shocks. To access the upper end of the rear shocks, remove the small section of the inner fender liner by removing the 3 screws holding it in place. Loosen all the control arm bolts. Raise the vehicle or lower the axle until the springs are loose and remove the springs. Set the axle onto a table or jack stands and remove the control arms from both the frame and the axle. With the axles removed, we can begin the process of removing the gas tank. On 4-door models, remove the fuel line roost guard and then disconnect the fuel lines. Be careful when you disconnect the lines because usually the lines have a little pressure built up and gas can shoot out of them. Detach the plastic bracket connecting the lines to the gas tank. Remove the transmission skid plate and set it aside. Support the gas tank and remove the bolts connecting it to the frame. Lower the gas tank a little bit until you can disconnect the gas lines and wiring on top of the tank. After you've removed the gas tank, cover the fuel line openings to prevent stuff from going inside, and then relocate the gas tank a safe distance away from any sparks or incendiary devices. Next, we need to remove the exhaust. Disconnect the exhaust mount from the cross member. Loosen the clamp just behind the cross member. Support the exhaust. Detach the bracket holding the rear section of the exhaust to the frame. These brackets have little hooks that will hold them in place once the bolts have been removed. The final mounting point is just behind where the control arm brackets are. Lubricate the pin on either side of the rubber and slide the pin out. Remove the exhaust from the vehicle. On vehicles with a turbo, the front section cannot be removed, so you will have to work around it. On vehicles without a turbo, remove the Y section of the exhaust, disconnect the oxygen sensors, and remove the exhaust at the headers from both sides of the engine. It's a good idea to put masking tape over the open exhaust holes to make sure nothing goes inside while cutting and grinding. In the video, we are using a plasma torch to cut the brackets, so we will disconnect all the brake lines and wiring and cover them with wet rags. At this stage, we are ready to remove the factory control arm brackets. This is a bit of a process, and we highly recommend marking out where you will be cutting. In the front, you will need to remove the upper control arm bracket and the inside portion of the lower control arm bracket. The new brackets will utilize the outer section of this lower control arm bracket. Here is an image of what the front brackets will look like when we are done with the cutting and grinding. To reiterate, do not cut off the outer section of the front lower control arm bracket. In the rear, completely remove the upper and lower brackets. Cut the brackets along where you've marked. If you don't have access or the experience necessary to use a torch, then a cutoff wheel is a perfectly acceptable alternative. Whatever method of cutting you use, wear the proper safety gear and take your time to cut carefully. Because this is such a crucial part of the process, we're going to show quite a bit of it. One of the things to think about is the directions that the sparks fly. Make sure they don't land on or near anything flammable. Always have a fire extinguisher on hand when doing this type of job. For cutting the welds, use a gouging tip on the plasma torch. On an acetylene torch, this is called a scarfing tip, but it's the same idea on both of them. On the rear lower bracket, cut along the center line, and then pry the bracket apart to provide better access to the welds. Where the rear upper bracket connects to the frame on top, place a sheet of metal behind to keep sparks from shooting out onto the whole underside of the vehicle. If you're using a cutting wheel, this upper section is a little hard to remove, so it's best to just leave it. After the cutting is complete, use a grinder and smooth out where the brackets were. If the frame is cut or gouged during the cutting, then it is a good idea to weld up these holes at this time. In the area where the new rear bracket will go, there is a place where the frame is welded. For the best fit, the bracket needs to rest against a smooth surface. Modify the body mount bracket located just in front of where the rear brackets were. Use the provided template and mark the area you need to trim. We use a body saw to trim this, although it should be noted this could also have been done with the torch or cutoff wheel. Smooth over the sharp edges. Prime, and then paint all of the exposed metal surfaces. Use a quality etching primer and enamel paint to best protect the frame from rusting in the future. We are ready to install the brackets. This involves a little bit of drilling, but otherwise it's a pretty straightforward process. We'll begin on the rear by sliding the backing plate into place. On the driver's side of Jeeps with a turbo, there are some coolant lines in the way. Remove the screw and gently pull down on the coolant lines and slide the backing plate into place. Using one of the bolts from the gas tank, temporarily set the rear bracket into place. On the driver's side, use a bolt from the exhaust skid plate, which will not be reinstalled. Install the 3 bolts that go into the backing plate. Push up firmly on the front of the rear bracket and tighten down all the bolts currently installed. Use a transfer punch and mark a spot in the hole on the underside, as well as where the upper flex arm will mount. Remove the bracket and the backing plate. Drill the holes in incremental steps up to 11/16 of an inch. The frame metal is hardened, and the hole where the upper arm will mount goes near a weld, so drilling will take a little bit of time, but with sharp drill bits and a good drill, it goes pretty smoothly. We can now install the TeraFlex bracket permanently. Use the bolt from the gas tank or the exhaust skid plate to hold the bracket in place. There are 2 provided flag nuts. Slide the long one with 2 openings into the frame first. This is held in place temporarily by the upper flex arm bolt. The second goes around the first and sits on the bottom of the bracket. Apply red thread locker onto the bolt and feed it into the flag nut. Slide the backing plate into place and install the 3 bolts with red thread locker. Tighten down the bolts evenly so the bracket is flush with the frame. The gas tank bolt on the passenger side will need to be removed later and reinstalled with the gas tank, so hold off on applying thread locker or torquing this bolt until after the gas tank has been installed. Place the front bracket onto the frame and hold it on there with a bolt that attaches to the remainder of the factory bracket. A second bolt attaches to a threaded hole on the bottom of the bracket. Tighten the bolts so that the bracket is held firmly to the frame. Use a center punch to mark the center of the 2 holes you need to drill. Remove the bracket. Drill the front hole in steps up to 5/8 inch. On the driver's side of vehicles with a turbo, use a short drill bit with a right angle drill to make the pilot hole, and then use a step bit to open up the hole. Drill the rear hole in steps up to 9/16 inch. After you are done, paint any exposed metal. Reinstall the brackets in the same manner as before. The second lower bolt uses a flag nut that installs through a slotted hole behind the body mount. The bolt that goes into the drilled out holes uses a flag nut that installs through the large hole directly below the body mount. Install the more rear of these two bolts first. Before installing the control arms, adjust them to the starting lengths given in the written instructions. Measure the control arms on the inside of the bend from the center of the bushing to the center of the bushing on the opposite end. In the written instructions, we give some recommended starting lengths for each of the arms. The Alpine flex arms will likely be adjusted when you have an alignment done, but these measurements will get you close to what things should be. On the front upper control arms, measure to the center of the bolt hole on the forked end. Install the upper arm using the provided bolt, which attaches to the flag nut already installed. Install the lower arm using the factory arm hardware, but in the new location. Final tighten all the bracket hardware. If you have IR control arms, then you can final tighten the arm hardware. Otherwise, wait to tighten the arms until the end of the installation when the vehicle is back on the ground and the suspension is under load. Install the new crossbar. You want to slide the bolts in from above, but some trims, like the one shown here, the exhaust on the passenger side prevents you from doing that, so insert the bolt from the bottom if this is the case. Reinstall the exhaust. Reinstall the gas tank. Make sure the fuel lines and electrical connectors are all properly reconnected. The factory bolt on the underside of the rear passenger bracket is also used on the gas tank, so you will need to remove it before installing the gas tank. On the four-door model, the fuel line roost guard needs to be trimmed to fit over the long arm bracket. Install the skid plate onto the crossbar. The factory transmission skid plate is also reinstalled and shares a bolt with the new differential skid plate. If you have the Alpine IR long arms, which are included in the RT suspension system, then you will have received a pair of IR bushings for the front axles. There are several effective ways to remove and install these bushings. Probably the best way is to utilize a ball joint press. However, if you have a Rubicon, then the fitting for the breather hose comes up out of the top. Using a ball joint press was a little more difficult, so we decided to cut out the rubber inside of the bushing using a hole saw. Once the pin was out, we used a chisel bit on an air hammer to push out the bushing. You can also use a regular chisel and hammer. This method is also effective because the bushings in the JL axles are very tight. No matter how you choose to remove the bushings, remember that you want to avoid breaking that fitting for the breather hose. On the passenger side, the bushing goes in from the outside. With the ball joint press, make sure you are pushing on the outside ring and not the rubber or the pin. Lubricate the outside of the bushing with grease or mineral oil. On the driver's side, you still need to be aware of that breather hose fitting. We were able to get the bushing started, and then we switched to a longer tube and pushed the bushing in the rest of the way. Reinstall the axles both in the front and the rear. Support the axle throughout the whole process. If you have the Alpine IR long arms, then feel free to torque the hardware at this time. But if you are installing the regular Alpine long arms, then wait until the vehicle is on the ground to torque the long arm hardware. Reconnect all the cables, hoses, ABS and brake lines, rotors, calipers, brake line brackets, drive shafts, springs, shocks, sway bar links, track bars, and anything else not mentioned on this list but is necessary for the vehicle to drive. Before you hit the trail, it is important to get an alignment done by someone who is familiar with lifted off-road vehicles.